you can't be securing your environment for the things that you have experienced in the past. You really need to be looking, forward looking in terms of the way you think about risks.
Hi, I'm Roark Pollock, and this is the first season of the Secure Tracks podcast, where we host rail industry leaders to talk about operational rail technologies and cybersecurity. In this episode, we're talking about digitalization and its impact on the rail industry. I'm super excited about today's conversation because we have with us Dr. Mark Grant. Mark is a longtime cybersecurity leader, having worked at CSX in the United States, specifically in Jacksonville, Florida, for about 17 years. And Mark served as the Chief Information Security Officer for 8 years during his time with CSX. Mark, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Roark. It's great to have an opportunity this morning to talk a little bit about rail tech security.
Awesome. Well, Mark, I introduced you as Dr. Mark Grant, but your doctorate is not necessarily in a field I think most would expect. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your doctorate, how you got into the rail industry, and how you got into cybersecurity?
Okay, yeah. So my PhD is actually in condensed matter physics, and that's from University of Florida. And, my time there, interestingly enough, I spent a lot of time sort of programming. And back then we used to use Fortran, which is kind of what all the scientists used. And so I was either doing that or spending a lot of time hooking computers up to lab equipment and things like that. So the transition for me from sort of being a physics guy to a computer guy was actually fairly easily. And I was finishing up a postdoc in in Texas at UTEP there, and moved back to Jacksonville and ended up getting a job in sort of the computer industry. I thought it was going to be a bit of a temporary job, but it turned out that the work was extremely interesting, and I was having some success there. So eventually I ended up working for the railroad and here in Jacksonville, where CSX is headquartered, and then eventually moved into the CISO role. So it was certainly different work than academia, but challenging and rewarding work.
Well, not your typical career path, but Mark, you're making me feel a little old talking about Fortran. I remember my Fortran undergraduate course in engineering.
Yeah, it was the language that people used back then. It was fast and it was efficient, and people oftentimes were doing a lot of number crunching, and it was a good language for that.
Yeah, it was good for that. Well, Mark, let's jump into our first topic and talk about the increases in digitalization in rail operations. I know when you and I spoke previous to the show, you mentioned this concept about how the rail industry or rail companies have gone through kind of 3 different waves of digitalization. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your view there, how you see that, and kind of how that has played out over your 17-year career with CSX.
Yeah, I definitely have, seen that. And, having been there, I guess I started there, kind of late 90s. But, I think the first wave, when you think about railroads, and railroads have been around for a long time, but you think about railroads, they used to be run on paper. And, people did all the work on paper. There were huge staffs that kind of handled all these papers and passed them around. And so the first wave, I think, of digitization was really about moving from a paper process to a computer-based process. And they did that,
right.
They were looking for efficiencies. So, and that worked. I mean, they had, huge staffs who were able to reduce clerical staff quite a bit. These were sort of mainframe-based systems. If you're talking about the kind of 70s and onto the 80s, and those things ran for decades, big consolidated systems, big data centers, particularly as the industry consolidated more. When you think about the freight environment in the U.S., and they did what they were supposed to do. The second wave, as I think about it, was kind of about the time I started. And if you think about the .com era, and what you began to see was, a move away from, you still had the mainframes, but you began to see things like internet connectivity. You began to see things like desktops on people's, desks, laptops, even tablets a little bit later on.
Mm-hmm.
And you also began to see a lot more digitization of the actual operations. You got things like computer aided dispatching. You got digital controlled, signals and switches. Things that used to be relays and wires became, sort of digitized. And the drive there from a business perspective, as I saw it, was all about continuing that automation. So, but the automation was a little bit different. It wasn't just the clerical stuff. It was like, tied to the core business and the transportation. So you got a lot more, equipment in your data centers that was more directly connected to stuff in the field. And the third phase, I think, really right now is what we're experiencing is being driven primarily by this huge investment the railroads made in positive train control. Now, they sort of reluctantly made that investment, I think, at first, because it was a regulation process that, they were kind of, forced to do that. But what that did was really instrumented the railroad more fully. So you got tens of thousands, of additional points, on the wayside. You had more onboard computers on locomotives, and what companies are doing now is like figuring out how to leverage that investment. So now that you've got that instrumentation, what do you do? And the goal of this third phase, which we're really getting into now, is about intelligent control. So it's about using the information that's there and having the computer be more of an active process of decision making across the railroad. And again, that's going to, there's huge opportunity there for enhancing efficiency, particularly for the large rail networks and the interconnectivity between networks, the touch points, the transfer points from one rail to the other.
Got it. So, Mark, how do you think about with that digitalization? I mean, how is that shaping or changing the operational part of the business, and what are the real benefits to the business?
Well, I think the primary thing is really about the flood of new information that you're getting from this rail tech implementation. Now that you kind of have all of these points out there that are collecting information about your operations, the opportunity and the way it's changing the industry is, people are busily trying to figure out how to use that. And this is information that is the most vital information to a railroad, which is about, the operations. And if you think about the problem, there are really two things, I think, when you think about the opportunity and the I call it a problem. It's not really a problem. It's more of an opportunity. But the challenge of figuring out in a complex rail network, a complex networked environment, is how do you get all of the shipments that you have, and they're all going different places.
Right.
How do you get from point A to point B with a given shipment in the most efficient manner? What speed should the train go? What route should it take? And I'm talking here mainly about freight railroads, but that problem is, I would say, almost 100% solvable by technology. And, it hasn't been solved completely yet. The environment's complex. Things happen that you don't expect. You have a plan, and then say a track gets washed out, or you've got some kind of other operational issue, maybe your locomotive isn't working like you want it to, that one event has a ripple effect across the entire railroad, potentially. Right. And so this problem of efficiency is not just hey, we figure out the plan and then we're done. It has to be continually adjusted and continually modified.
It has to be dynamic.
Yeah, it's got to be dynamic.
It's the Mike Tyson of the railroad industry, right? Everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, the railroads, they get hit in the face frequently with all sorts of things. So that right. problem is a technology problem at the core, I think. And
that makes sense.
Yeah. And, the other problem you've got, and so you've got all this information now, and like, how do you leverage that to build an intelligent environment that can make those decisions for you, instead of having a person looking at the disruption, looking at what's occurred and trying to sort of refactor what they should do. You want a system to be making some of those decisions, because it's going to be faster and arguably better, because that system is going to have a view of the entire network instead of the local environment of the people that are sometimes making the decisions now. So,
it's just becoming more automated in some of the functions.
Yeah. And that drives huge efficiencies across your rail network. And so and the other piece is, it's like, how do you become easier to do business with? And again, technology is going to be a big part of that solution. How do you provide additional visibility to your customers about the options for shipment? How do you give them a price that reflects, your true costs of moving that freight? How do you make it easier for them to engage with you and become a customer? And that again is it's largely a collaboration problem with your customers, and that's I think technology is a big part of that solution as well.
Certainly, that's a bigger issue for the passenger railroads even than the freight railroads, I think.
Yeah, it's the same challenge. It has to be easier. And if you look at some of the companies now that are largely digital companies, and there are plenty of examples, they're operating in a manner that is super easy for people to engage.
Sure. And, you can get almost anything delivered to your house in 24 hours.
That's less. Right. And that's a transportation, challenge as well. But that's been, people have solved that. And someone will figure this out, for the rail industry. And I think the time is going to be soon when that occurs, and they're going to have a huge advantage, when they do that.
That makes sense. Well, Mark, you're talking about the digitalization that's happening in the, we've kind of described it as the operational rail technology environment. Right. What do you think of as the scope of that operational environment? What's included? What's in that? What's not part of that scope? Is it everything within the rail company? I mean,
well, to me, I think, clearly railroads have a lot of different, solutions that they use, a lot of technology solutions. But to me, the most vital ones are those things that are sort of wired into the operations. Those are the critical core technologies that run railroads. And what we're talking about there, I think, are, sort of signaling systems, switching systems, dispatching environments, train control type environments.
Sure.
And, increasingly, you're seeing, clearly stuff on locomotives. There have been computers on locomotives for a long time, but there's more and more integration now that there's, additional connectivity there because of the sort of positive train control investments that people have made. Those things are connected. And increasingly, you're even seeing now, stuff on rail cars. In the past, the way you kept track of where your rail cars were on freight railroads anyway, was, you had RFIDs on the cars. They all have them. It's an industry standard that passes an RFID reader, and then you get an update on where your car's at. But, you may go many miles until you pass one of those RFIDs, and a lot of things can happen in between. So, Now you're starting to see things like GPS on every car, and there are initiatives to sort of get that out, and that's going to change again. It's going to change the accuracy with which you can address, the location and your planning systems, and it's also going to, allow customers to have a better understanding of exactly where their stuff's at and when it's going to show up.
Yeah. Well, Mark, what do you think of as the long-term implications of all this digitalization? I know where we are today, but where's the industry going, do you think?
Well, I mean, they're clearly chasing, efficiencies. All the railroads, closely watch their operating ratios. This
Right.
is something that clearly the market is interested in terms of how people think about their investments. But eventually, what's going to start to happen is you're going to have these environments where you're using intelligent systems to make decisions. It's going to drive better operations, and it's also going to enable ultimately autonomous operations. So maybe it's not the whole network. There are clearly challenges still in getting there, but that's what folks I think are thinking of down the road.
Right.
But again, it's just going to be it's going to increase reliance on your systems, your computers, to make decisions versus operators, even from an operational standpoint.
Right. Well, we're starting to see in that every time I fly through Dallas Fort Worth, there's nobody driving that train
That's
at the
right.
airport.
I mean, you already get it on some of the commuter lines and light rail. Those systems are already in place. But in terms of the freight, right now you've always got people on the locomotive. Can argue one way or the other whether it makes sense not to have someone there. But I think the technology is ultimately going to enable that. And
Right.
you're seeing it on automobiles. Clearly, trucks are looking at the same thing. And the problem's a lot easier on a railroad than it is, say a car or a truck, because you have complete control of the network. It's a bit of a one-dimensional problem versus two-dimensional. So it's arguably easier to solve that issue on a railroad than it is any other mode of transportation.
That makes sense. Well, Mark, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's start talking a little bit more about cyber. We've talked about digitalization. We've talked about the railroads. Um, as I understand it, there's a lot of CISOs in the rail industry that are now, perhaps for the first time, being asked to take ownership of the cybersecurity risk in these operational rail technology or rail tech environments. If it's a first time that a CISO has now had to deal with these operational systems, how do they start to think of, or how do they think about getting their hands around the situation and starting to understand the associated risk that exists within these environments?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that the CISOs in general, and I've worked quite a bit with a number of CISOs across the industry
Right.
in my career, and I think they understand the risks. So it's not a question of the CISOs understanding the risks, but I do think in certain environments there are challenges with getting cycles on the business side to talk to them about the risks and to make them more understand cybersecurity risks. And it makes sense because the operations people have a hard, difficult job. They they have challenges just on a day-to-day basis dealing with the things that occur, and making sure that they're supporting the business in their roles. And so it's hard to talk to them about a hypothetical sort of bad thing that could happen when they have in some cases they have challenges every day that they're dealing with. And that's really where it I think is most challenging, is how did the CISOs become sort of partners with their cohorts that are more directly responsible for rail operations. And spending time with the business is a great thing always for CISOs to do. That should be a big part of their job. In my opinion, is sort of working with the business on challenges, and having a supportive leadership, is clearly helpful as well. So you not just operations folks, your CEO, even your board. I know that most CISOs, at least that I'm familiar with in the freight industry, spend a lot of time updating their boards, and
Right.
that all is extremely helpful for sort of building that ecosystem of security. It's like it can't be the CISO with sort of his finger in the dam, protecting everybody. It's got to be everybody in the company understand.
Absolutely.
They've got a role. They have to understand the risks, and they have to understand that they have a role in helping manage that.
Right. Mark, so I know that sometimes I run into CISOs that perhaps cut their teeth in other industries and they move into the rail industry. They're very experienced in operational security, perhaps in other industrial control systems based industries. How do you think of what's different between the rail industry, perhaps, and other industrialized industries?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'll start by talking about kind of what's the same. Really, at the fundamental level, some of the technologies are similar. So Linux, in the energy sector is going to look a lot like Linux in the rail sector, and so
Right.
the attacks on those systems, are likely going to look similar. The tools that the attackers use are going to be, probably the same. But I think the what is critical and different about railroads, and what sort of makes each sector or each industry a little bit different is, it's the context. It's like the business context. So understanding what are the important systems, what is the function of this, Linux device, what's the function of the SCADA, system, and how is it important to the business? That's the part that sort of makes the different industries. It differentiates the industries, and so it's like without that business context and without understanding the role of the device you're trying to protect, you're missing a huge opportunity. You have to understand where to focus, what are the most important things to protect, and the protocols. There may be a lot of similarities in the environment, but there are very specific protocols that are used, particularly in the rail industry. These things, because of the interoperable nature of the environments. I mean,
Right.
railroads have had to have standards and had to have consistent processes for hundreds of years, because a lot of shipments start on one railroad and end up on another railroad. So the way you manage that in an IT environment is you have to have standards on how those things are handed off. You have to have protocols that are understood, across the environment, and it's that understanding of that protocol, I think, does sort of make the rail tech a very specific type of technology, and the way that you think about protecting it.
Yeah, I think the protocol is just the starting point. I think that's quite often, Mark. And as you talk about the context, I think it's much broader than just understanding the protocol. It's understanding the business case, the safety case that's involved, and the applications, whether it's signaling, interlocking systems, train control systems. Those are all tend to be very unique to the rail industry. So
Yeah,
I
and
think you hit on a key topic there about it's understanding that context and underlying what that particular device or machine means to the overall system.
yeah, and even recently, I've worked with companies, rail companies that had people in their environment that were trying to work on security plans and trying to formulate strategies, and trying to sort of apply a generic approach into an environment. And it, and you asked the question about, hey, someone new to the industry, and in this case, it was someone, new to the industry, that was in charge of sort of, managing this process. And, they had to reach out to some rail people and say, hey, we get the technology, but what we're struggling with is, how do we translate the things that we know into a rail environment? So they had to go get some, some additional rail expertise to help with that.
Right. Makes good sense. Well, Mark, we're talking a little bit about the risk side of the equation and some of the risk that perhaps exists, but how much of this is really a problem? I mean, you don't hear much about high consequence cyber events in the rail industry, maybe not including a bit of, outside of the situation in the war in Ukraine, but are there events that we just don't simply hear about? What's the true situation that exists as far as consequences?
Well, I mean, let me sort of tackle the question.
Not to put you on the spot.
No, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's fine. There are the good news and a very helpful news in terms of CISOs in the rail industry is that there is a fair amount of robust communication across the industry. And, railroads, clearly compete with each other. But when it comes to security, the industry has focused on, communication channels, best practice sharing. There's committees that run through the American Association of Railroads, which share a lot of information about, things that are going on.
Right.
And I can say, and I have good understanding of, events that have happened over the years. And they're really, it's not like there's a secret, disruptive, terrible cyber attacks that have been happening and somehow everybody's just keeping that quiet. There really just hasn't been, a lot that's impacted the rail industry in terms of significant consequences. Now, when people think about risk, though, in the rail industry, it's recognized that it's there. It doesn't, just because there hasn't been a significant disruption doesn't mean that it can't happen. And so I think that is really what the biggest risk is. Is a disruption of, and it'll probably, the most damaging would be on those core operational technologies. But a prolonged, and most railroads can take a hit as well. I mean, they can take a brief outage, and these things happen sometimes, normally not because of cybersecurity events, just because of other, things that happen in an IT environment. But, if it's short and it's fixed, quickly, usually, things are okay. But it's really those prolonged disruptions that would be days or, even in some cases weeks. If you talk about certain scenarios, those are the ones that are the biggest risk.
Right.
And there are safety potentially, the processes and the system design for railroads in terms of safety are excellent. And railroads have also done a lot of work, I know, because I've done some of it myself, to try to look for cyber scenarios that could lead to safety issues, testing and pen testing and other types of threat modeling type approaches. And the good news is there's a lot of sort of resilience built into the process. There's a lot of fail safes in the system. They had to be fail safe before computers were even running railroads. So there haven't been a lot demonstrated there that says, hey, look, this is kind of the big safety issue. Now,
well, it's good news, bad news, I guess you're saying. Is the good news is not much is happening, and that's great, and it's a good sign. The bad news is people are still worried about what could happen.
Yeah, things could happen.
Trying to deal with those situations, I guess so.
Yeah, and so have we seen it? No. Is it possible? Yes, is the way I would summarize that. And probably yes on the safety side, although we haven't seen those things demonstrated yet, but you got to think that there's a lot of moving parts. You got to think that some of that stuff's possible. Now it's not easy, so it's gonna, in order to really get in there and cause issues, from what I have seen and my experiences, it's going to have to be a sophisticated attack.
Right. Well, Mark, let's talk a little bit about the side of CISO that causes a little bit of heartburn. What are those worst case situations that a rail CISO worries about in this operational rail tech environment? I mean, is it the adversary that worries you most, or maybe high consequence safety events, or are they mainly focused on or worried about service disruptions? What gets the attention of the CISO the most, keeps them up at night, and maybe gets the most attention within the executive suite as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, it's probably service disruption, just because of we've seen that across a number of industries, particularly with ransomware sort of, maybe it doesn't get into your control systems, but it impacts enough of your environment that it really causes you issues. It even bleeds over into those environments in terms of the impacts, even if the ransomware doesn't make it there. So, those I think that's what people worry about. And the CISOs are very aware of those critical systems, what they are. They have additional resiliency plans around those in terms of disaster recovery. Everybody understands what those systems are. I probably wouldn't make sense to specifically name them, but they know what they are. It's like that system when you get the call, at 2 a.m. and it's from, the operations, and they're like, hey, the system went down, 10 minutes ago, and we're already delaying trains. It's those environments that CISOs worry about.
Well, and I assume from a safety standpoint, there's a lot of overlap between the safety cases that have been developed in cybersecurity cases, and so a lot of those have been dealt with in the past and have been built out pretty robustly already, I assume.
Yeah, I think that's true. And there's just so much experience in the environment, over using these systems, seeing how they react, seeing how they fail. Now, I will say that, in a cyber attack, an interesting twist is, the system is probably or may not fail in a way that you expect it to. And that's, normally these kind of failure modes that are understood are based on, this is the way the thing breaks. But, if someone's in there actively manipulating the environment, it may fail in unexpected ways.
Right.
So that, there's a little bit of a uncertainty ultimately about what the outcome could be when someone's in there, messing around with it.
Yeah, understood. So, Mark, are there systems or applications within the operational rail tech environment that CISOs worry more about than others, maybe given their vulnerability or perceived vulnerability or the possible consequences? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, when you live in a world where you can't do everything at once, how do you think about prioritizing your efforts in some of these environments?
Yeah, I mean, there is I think a tension between, a decision process and sort of risk analysis that goes into to all the security plans, and a tension between sort of the IT environment, which, is typically where you see, most security incidents happen. I mean, you've got people, involved in there. You've got people potentially, leveraging cloud services, leveraging the internet,
Right.
Reading emails, which is always a risky process. You've got more activity there with more users that are doing all sorts of things, to kind of complete their tasks for the day. You've got internet connectivity, so there's this, and those are important systems too, from a business perspective. They're not the most critical for railroads, but they are important. And so, to me, there's a tension in terms of how much effort and resources do we devote to that environment where we see a lot more activity versus how much do we devote to sort of this operational technology world where we may not see nearly as much, cyber activity, but it's also way more important, arguably, to the business. So, that sort of risk analysis and thinking about the resources you have and how you use them.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are issues that come around, the tension between those two environments.
Right. Mark, are you seeing a change in the balance between where the focus is being placed in those environments over the last, let's say, half a dozen years or so? And looking forward, do you expect that to continue to change?
Yeah, no, yeah. I think that there is a huge has been a huge shift I've seen in the industry, and part of that has been, we talked a little bit about this kind of third wave of digitization. What comes with that is, you've got, systems in your IT environment, systems in your OT environment, and you're finding that the information that you're getting out of the OT environment is so useful that you want to use that in other places. And so, there's been additional sort of connectivity between those two environments. And I mean, traditionally those, were isolated, sometimes even air gapped. They're still isolated. They're choke points, as I see it in most railroads between the environments.
Right.
A lot of filtering takes place, but there is more connectivity. And so that, the CISOs are smart people. They say they, see connectivity and they're like, hey, that's an additional vector. It's an additional attack surface. The attack surface is growing in the operational technologies, and so
Yeah.
there's more of them, and increasingly they're more integrated with other environments.
Yeah. Well, Mark, let's shift gears one more time to our last topic of the day, and I know that we'll talk a little bit about the involvement government has in some of the regulatory things that have been coming down the pipe. Mark, I know you left CSX a couple of years ago, I think in 2021, and now you're working for yourself. You've got your own business, Risk Sec Group,
Yep.
if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a little bit about the work you're doing.
Yeah. So the Risk Sec Group, me and my partner and I, we're focused in a couple of areas. Cybersecurity is one, kind of like serving as a virtual CISO, which is, interestingly enough, is a new term I've seen pop up in the last several years. So we kind of offer, services like that. And we also do sort of, enterprise risk management, audit. We've got a bit of expertise in a lot of areas. So, yeah, we've been helping people, with their IT strategies, certainly with cybersecurity, and a lot of time recently has been around some of the new TSA regulations. If you're one of the big railroads, you've got staffs of people, you have lawyers, you've got cybersecurity teams, and kind of in a decent place. You probably already have a lot of frameworks in place and a lot of policies that are necessary. You've been doing this for a while, but some of the other railroads don't have as much resources, as much expertise on the cybersecurity and risk management side, and so they get this TSA regulation. They're like, what the heck do we do with this? So we've actually spent a fair amount of time working with some of the short lines and others in the industry, to kind of deal with those regulations.
That makes sense. So how, I know the TSA regulations, or the security directives, I guess they had three different versions over the last about 18 months. How is that playing out? Where are most of these companies in the process, and what are you seeing happening today?
Yeah, so the TSA is actively, writing regulation, and they have invested. You can tell. I mean, you get a sense as you kind of talk to the TSA that they have brought in people to run this process. So they didn't,
Right.
particularly around railroads, they had the pipelines also. that they started with, and the railroads, I think they're looking at additional regulation now on the airlines. But they've geared up. They've got people who have experience in these matters, people that have been involved in regulations in other industries, and they've kind of put the resources against it to make sure they're following up on the rules that they're making. And so the railroads, they're nobody likes regulation. Well, I don't want to say nobody, but a lot of people. There may be somebody out there who does, but a lot of people, they struggle with the concept of being forced, to apply their resources in certain areas versus,
Right.
Taking the risk approach that they've taken in the past. So that's why people don't like the regulations, and so people don't like them. But I think the TSA has done a okay job, of working with the industry, coming up with something. They made some adjustments based on feedback. There was a lot of conversation, so they're doing an okay job. And the railroads, are doing what they can, to comply. So they've got,
Right.
building the security plans, and sort of that's kind of where it's at now. It's like, hey, here's what our security environment looks like. This is what we plan to do in the future. That sort of thing is addressed in the regulation. And, just sort of getting ready for the next step, which is going to be, the beginning of the sort of audits from the TSA and inspection process. And I
Yeah.
do think, we should think about this as a process. It's more of a process than it is an event. There's going to be, I think, ongoing dialogue back and forth in terms of getting this to a point that the TSA is happy, with the additional protections that they're trying to make sure people have, and the railroads are happy,
Right.
because it's adding value actually to their program. And most of the big rails are doing the stuff already. They already have
Well, it's
everything in place. It's
certainly early days, I think, still.
yeah.
And you mentioned it's a process, and in fact, I know we've spoken about the fact that the TSA is now in the midst of a new rulemaking process as well, and not just sticking with the security directives. In fact, they gave notice or advance notice of this proposed rulemaking back in November last year. What do you expect to come out of that process that rail CISOs might want to think about sooner rather than later? Do you think it'll be the same as the security directives, or do you expect something different?
I think it's going to be more of the same. I believe directionally, it's going to be like we think, and you hope that someone, in government is doing an analysis of the adversaries and basing some of the regulations on, kind of what they see happening.
Right.
What's the risk, and how, understanding the risk based on analysis of what's actually happened, or what they see, or what intelligence they have. So, and the TSA talks about that. So you hope that, a fair amount of that is in there. But yeah, I mean, they've distributed, the proposed rulemaking. The industry has responded and given feedback. And, in general, the feedback is, I think, what you would expect. It's like, hey, don't paint us into a corner where we don't have options, and we can't make decisions locally about our environment and how we protect it,
Mm-hmm.
because, and you have to, it makes sense. You have to ask the question, like, who's in the best position to make those decisions? Is it the TSA, or, or is it the CISOs, who have a good understanding of their environment and really what the risks are? So, most of the comments, I think, appropriately are, hey, give us the flexibility to do what makes sense, and what is right for our company.
Yeah. Well, that makes perfect sense. Well, let's wrap this up, Mark. We'll wrap up a little bit here. I know in the work that you're now doing, you're working with different organizations with as part of Risk Set Group. What last bit of advice would you leave for your rail CISO brothers and sisters out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think be careful would be the threat environment. I mean, because of the increasing use of technology, in railroads. And because of the sort of, we always, it seems like for decades I've been talking about the increasing threat. It's like, hey, the threat is evolving, it's getting worse.
Yeah.
But that continues, unfortunately, it continues to be true. And, so that, I think that is just, that would be the advice I would give. It's like, hey, you can't be securing your environment for the things that you have experienced in the past. You really need to be looking, forward looking in terms of the way you think about risks, and you want to be able to enable your business with your security program to do the things that they need to do, to drive the business forward. You can't be,
Right.
You can't be the person that's holding it back because it's impossible to do because you can't secure it. You have to be out in front of that. You have to have the security there, even before sort of the next business initiative comes along. And
Right.
I think that's probably the most useful advice I could give based on my experience in the industry.
Yeah, that makes great sense. All right. Well, Mark, we really appreciate you being on the show today. If someone wanted to get in contact with you, Mark, which one of the social media platforms are you active on, or what's the best way to get in contact with you?
I think the best way is probably just use LinkedIn, because it's easy to find me on there, and you don't have to remember anything apart from my name, and you can probably track me down there, and if you send me a note, I'll respond to you.
All right. That's awesome, Mark. Thank you again. That's the end of today's show. Until next time, keep those tracks secure.